Hey everyone, I'm Kim Hunter. Yesterday we talked about what animal would you be if you could choose. Let's talk about what plant would you be if you could choose. I think I would like to be a bluebonnet. They come out every spring. Spring is one of my favorite seasons, and they have laws to protect them where you can't just like go out and mow them down or there are certain times that's best to pick them and they're just I look forward to seeing them every year. What plant would you be? All right, so we talked about the 8 characteristics of living organisms. They all will have at least one cell. They grow, they respond, reproduce, they move, use energy, exchange gases, and excrete waste. We talked about the levels of organization. Remember cells, tissue, organ system, organism. All right, but today we're going to talk about the principles of cell theory. So let's get started. The cell theory explains how living things are connected. Cells and living things carry on similar functions. So just like organisms do similar things, cells will do similar things too. So cells will grow and reproduce and extract energy. They're going to act like little organisms, and some of them actually are one-celled organisms. So let's look at the cell theory components. We've already talked about number one, how the cell is the smallest unit of life. Cells come from pre-existing cells. We've already discussed number three, that every living organism is composed of at least one cell. Cells contain all the hereditary information of the organism, and all cells have the same basic life functions. Just like organisms have common characteristics, cells are going to have those same common characteristics. So let's watch the history of cell theory. While this is loading, let's talk about this. You've got in your assignments tab, you have a worksheet that you're going to want to fill out, and it goes over what the cell theory is and the scientists behind it. So this is a good time to start filling out this worksheet.
One of the great things about science is that when scientists make a discovery, it's not always in a prescribed manner, as in only in a laboratory under strict settings with white lab coats and all sorts of neat science gizmos that go beep. In reality, the events and people involved in some of the major scientific discoveries are as weird and varied as they get. My case in point, the weird history of the cell theory. There are 3 parts to the cell theory. 1. All organisms are composed of one or more cells. 2. The cell is the basic unit of structure and organization in organisms. And 3. All cells come from pre-existing cells. To be honest, this all sounds incredibly boring until you dig a little deeper into how the world of microscopic organisms and this theory came to be. It all started in the early 1600s in the Netherlands, where a spectacle maker named Zacharias Janssen is said to have come up with the first compound microscope, along with the first telescope. Both claims are often disputed, as apparently he wasn't the only bored guy with a ton of glass lenses to play with at the time. Despite this, the microscope soon became a hot item that every naturalist or scientist at the time wanted to play with, making it much like the iPad of its day. One such person was a fellow Dutchman by the name of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who heard about these microscope doohickeys, and instead of going out and buying one, he decided to make his own. And it was a strange little contraption indeed, as it looked more like a tiny paddle the size of a sunglass lens. If he had stuck 2 together, it probably would have made a wicked set of sunglasses that you couldn't see much out of. Anywho, once Leeuwenhoek had his microscope ready, he went to town looking at anything and everything he could with them, including the gunk on his teeth. Yes, you heard right. He actually discovered bacteria by looking at dental scrapings, Which, when you keep in mind that people didn't brush their teeth much, if at all, back then, he must have had a lovely bunch of bacteria to look at. When he wrote about his discovery, he didn't call them bacteria as we know them today, but he called them animalcules because they looked like little animals to him. While Leeuwenhoek was staring at his teeth.
All right, so we are going to attribute Leeuwenhoek to naming the cell animalcules. He saw the cells under the microscope and called them animalcules.
Gunk. He was also sending letters to a scientific colleague in England by the name of Robert Hooke. Hooke was a guy who really loved all aspects of science, so he dabbled in a little bit of everything, including physics, chemistry, and biology. Thus it is Hooke who we can thank for the term the cell, as he was looking at a piece of cork under his microscope, and the little chambers he saw reminded him of cells, or the rooms monks slept in their monasteries. Think college dorm rooms, but without the TVs, computers, and really annoying roommates.
All right, so we are going to attribute Hooke to designing the microscope and naming cells. Like, yes, a lot of other scientists, including Leeuwenhoek, did make microscopes, but we are going to attribute Hooke to actually seeing and developing the microscope to see cells. And he did name the cell the cell.
Hooke was something of an underappreciated scientist of his day. Something he brought upon himself as he made the mistake of locking horns with one of the most famous scientists ever, Sir Isaac Newton. Remember when I said Hooke dabbled in many different fields? Well, after Newton published a groundbreaking book on how planets move due to gravity, Hooke made the claim that Newton had been inspired by Hooke's work in physics. Newton, to say the least, did not like that, which sparked a tense relationship between the two that lasted even after Hooke died, as quite a bit of Hooke's research, as well as his only portrait, was misplaced due to Newton. Much of it was rediscovered, thankfully, after Newton's time, but not his portrait, as sadly no one knows what Robert Hooke looked like. Fast forward to the 1800s, where two German scientists discovered something that today we might find rather obvious, but helped tie together what we now know as the cell theory. The first scientist was Matthias Schleiden, a botanist who liked to study plants under a microscope. From his years of studying different plant species, it finally dawned on him that every single plant he had looked at were all made of cells. At the same time, on the other end of Germany was Theodor Schwann, a scientist who not only studied slides of animal cells under the microscope and got a special type of nerve cell named after him, but also invented rebreathers for firefighters and had a kickin' pair of sideburns. After studying animal cells for a while, he too came to the conclusion that all animals were made of cells. Immediately, he reached out via snail mail, as Twitter had yet to be invented, to other scientists working in the same field, and it was Schleiden who got back to him, and the two started working on the beginnings of the cell theory. A bone of contention arose between them, as for the last part of the cell theory, that cells come from pre-existing cells, Schleiden didn't exactly subscribe to that thought, as he swore cells came from free cell formation, where they just kind of spontaneously crystallized into existence. That's when another scientist, named Rudolf Virchow, stepped in with research showing that cells did come from other cells. Research that was actually, how to put it, borrowed without permission from a Jewish scientist by the name of Robert Remak, which led to two more feuding scientists. Thus, from Teethgunk to torquing off Newton, crystallization to Schwann cells, the cell theory came to be an important part of biology today. Some things we know about science today may seem boring, but how we came to know them is incredibly fascinating. So if something bores you, dig deeper. It's probably got a really weird story behind it somewhere.
All right, so let's go back to our presentation. All right, so in your assignments tab, there is a graphic organizer that's going to ask you about Robert Hooke, Anton de Leeuwenhoek, Matthias Schleiden, Theodor Schwann, and Rudolf Virchow. So if you'll take the time to do this now, that would be great.